This is our office, and I think this wall is looking far too plain. So we're going to take this logo and put it up on the wall.
First, let's get some perspective of what I'd like to do.
This is the tree portion of our logo and what we want to put on the wall, although not quite as big as this. So we're going to do the tree out of timber, and we want to have metal lettering running along the bottom. More on that later. But for the tree, we mold over different approaches to do this. We thought about making each branch as a steam bent piece, which I think would look really good, but it would be a huge amount of work. I think it would be very difficult to get the junction between the branches looking good. And on top of that, I think some of the bends are tighter than we could achieve with steam bending. So we looked at laminations that might allow us to have tighter bends, but we'd still have all the other problems. So instead, we're going to use router templates. But we're going to make things a little bit more complicated because for this branch here, we're going to have the grain going this direction, for this one, this direction, and so on. So the next job is take this to the CAD software, extrude it up the way, slice it all up, and move it to the 3D printer.
While those templates are printing, it's a good time to think about the lettering. I want the lettering to be metal because I think the contrast between the timber tree and the metal letters will look really good, but this isn't something I can make for myself in this workshop, so I need the letters to be custom made from my CAD model. That's where JLC CNC comes in, the sponsor of today's video. My background is in product development, so I've been creating manufacturing drawings and having custom parts made for over 20 years. Historically, this process was complex and something mostly reserved for professional businesses, but these days it's much more accessible to everyone. Once you've created the CAD files, you can drag and drop them into JLC CNC's website, then you can go through the various options and you should be given a live quote. Then simply click to place the order, and it will arrive at your door in a surprisingly short amount of time. For this project, I'm having the letters CNC machined from aluminium with a brushed and clear anodized finish. Let's get this ordered and then I can get back to the templates. I remember a few videos back somebody commenting and thanking us for not being one of those channels that uses a 3D printer all the time. I think I'm going to have to apologize to that person in this video because we will use the 3D printer a lot. But what I would also say is a 3D printer is just another tool, and it is a really useful tool to have. Each branch of the tree was separated so we could cut it out separately, and because our 3D printer wasn't big enough, we also had to print some of the branches as multiple parts and then glue them together. The plan is to make the logo from some leftover ash we have from a previous project. Since we have the templates to hand, we can put them on top of the rough sawn ash and work out what's the best way to nest it all together to get the aesthetic that we want, so we don't have to process any more timber than we need to. And then with the boards squared and thicknessed, I can then glue them together. I found that it's well worth taking the time to remove the glue squeeze out, particularly from your top surface. This can be really difficult to remove later on if you do let it dry. The approach that I favour is using a damp cloth to remove the squeeze out, but you can also wait 10-15 minutes for the glue to go gummy and then just use a scraper to remove it. But if you don't remove it, the glue goes rock solid and it can be really difficult to remove. Once the glue's dried, I can then sand the board down. Always much easier to do at this stage rather than later on. There were a few defects on the panel, particularly on the back side. Now, I'm not too worried about these because they're on the back, and also because of the shape of the branches means I can probably just avoid these areas. But it's going to be much easier to fix now, so I figured why not? And yes, that blue plaster is because the chisel decided it wanted to be better acquainted with my finger. I then took my time to get the final location of all the template pieces. I paid particular attention to the grain direction, as well as any defects I wanted to avoid or nice bits of grain that I wanted to include. It's also important to make sure there was enough space between each template for a saw blade to go. Once I was confident in the final location, I traced them out so I could cut this big panel down to more manageable pieces with the jigsaw. I have to admit the jigsaw is one of my least favourite tools. I just find it a bit rough, too much force is involved, and sometimes it just gives you a really nasty cut. Now, I've experimented with various different things, but if anybody can see me doing anything wrong, I am open to constructive criticism. Maybe it's the blade, maybe it's the tool, maybe it's just me, or maybe this is just the way things are. With the panel cut up into more manageable chunks, I can then use double-sided tape to stick the templates into position. And then on the true version of our logo, this junction is actually a sharp angle, but I knew I wasn't going to be able to achieve this with the router, so I rounded it off in the CAD, and now I can drill it out, which will make it easier for the router, but it will also make it easier at the bandsaw. I then cut everything out at the bandsaw. I try and get as close to the line as possible, about 0.5 millimeter where I can achieve that. That does take a little bit longer and a lot more care to achieve that, but it's well worth the extra time as it makes the routering much easier and much safer. Because this is a smaller bandsaw, I am limited to my maximum cut width. That means at times I had to be a bit more creative about the angles that I cut into and the number of cuts I had to make to get into some of the angles. And that was also the reason the logo was the size it was, because I wouldn't be able to make it any bigger than it is here. But I think it all works out very nicely in the end. I've used plenty of benchtop bandsaws in the past, and I can tell you doing this kind of work on them would not have been possible. They just don't have enough power to make even moderate cuts in hardwoods like this, and they don't have enough guidance on the tool to make those cuts accurately. This saw is relatively new to me still, but I can say at the moment I am a huge fan of it. It truly seems like a professional grade tool that's just been scaled down to benchtop size. And it took me a lot of research and a lot of hunting to find this particular tool, because all the others just sit in that hobby grade. And I'd say that while they're much cheaper than this product, they are considerably worse value than this product. So if you are in the market for a bandsaw and you want it to do work like this, I thoroughly recommend checking out the link in our description. And then quickly before taking it over to the router, I thought it'd be a good idea to sand off any rough areas, any areas that are protruding a little bit too much still, and paying a little bit of extra attention to the end grain areas. One thing we learned from our previous project is ash is a grabby wood and it doesn't respond well to compression bits. Instead, we're going to use a range of different router bits, working down in diameter so we can work our way into those corners. This router bit was gifted to us by Find Buy Tools, and I think it might be the perfect router bit for this job. Though I have to say I've never worked with a router bit this size, and I was quite intimidated by it. As I said, ash is a grabby wood, so I wasn't sure how well it would respond to this kind of cutter. There was a slight little grab just then, but after that it cut like a hot knife through butter. And then the end grain can always be particularly troublesome, so I was a little bit apprehensive here, making sure that if it did grab it, then my fingers would just go down and not into the cutter. But I had nothing to fear, it just cut straight through it like it was any other bit of wood. And then I think I got a bit greedy here. It was all going so well, so I tried to go right to the end, which of course was a bad move because it's paper thin there. But nothing to worry about, that's easily sorted at the sander later on. Despite this part being bigger, it also had more awkward areas that concerned me, so I decided to bring out the micro jig grippers to hold everything securely. This product's actually designed for use over at the table saw and it's really good there, but I also find it really useful over at the jointer and the router table. Over time I find I've collected quite a few of these push blocks from different brands and I definitely prefer the micro jig products. The rubber on them is just much softer and it grips much better than anything else I've used. It wasn't all smooth sailing though. With this part, for whatever reason, it grabbed it and split the wood. Interestingly, I went in again with this bit of wood from the other side and again it grabbed and caused a bit of a problem. I feel I've still got plenty to learn when it comes to the router table, particularly when using trickier woods like ash, so if you can see anything I'm doing wrong, please do let me know. I think with the first cut I started into the end grain a little bit, which could have been the source of the problem, but when I flipped it round and did the second cut, that should have been the same as any other part in the project, and yet it still went wrong. When I have worked through the rest of the project, I didn't encounter any other problems, so I'm really not sure what happened in this particular instance. This cutter being such a large diameter was only able to work its way so far into the corners, so once I'd done all the surfaces I was able to, I swapped it out for a smaller diameter cutter. I was slightly apprehensive making these cuts because as I move into the corners, at a certain point the cutter's going to be cutting on both sides. This could lead to problems, so I was sure to take it slowly and make sure that the piece was held down very securely. And then I stepped down the router bit diameter again to get into the last bit of the corners. This router bit was actually a compression bit, which I said I'd learned was a no-no, but I think because it was removing so little material, it went no problem. And at long last, we're done with these templates. And we can now give everything a final sand down. We don't need to match any perfect template anymore, as long as the edges are smooth, that's all that we need to achieve. The oscillating belt sander is a great tool for this job. You've got the flat surface in the middle that allows you to get nice wide arcs, but at either end of the belt you've got a tight radius and a larger radius which allows you to get into various other nooks and crannies. And if none of that works out for you, then you've got the option to remove the belt assembly entirely and turn it into an oscillating spindle sander. For the longest time I couldn't get a nice surface finish off this sander, but eventually I found out it was because of the cheap sanding belts I purchased off Amazon. On these belts, the join where this belt is formed was lumpy and that threw everything off. With the more expensive belts that I'd purchased from a proper woodworking shop, all those problems disappeared. Just another example of buying cheap means buying twice. One of the branches on our logo is green, and we wanted that reflected on the timber. We did briefly look at paint for this, but we quickly veered away from that because we thought the paint would mask the timber grain. We then looked into tinted Hardwax oils, and I think that would have been a really good option, but we couldn't get our hands on any in time. So instead we looked at this wood dye. We did a few experiments off camera to find the best way to apply this, but one thing to note is this is a water-based dye, and if we use an alcohol-based dye, the rules are completely different. We found that the best approach was to first water pop the grain and sand that down, and then apply the first coat really liberally, wait for it to soak in, and then wipe away the excess. Once that coat is dried, you apply a second coat, again really thick, but this time let it soak in and dry naturally. Assembly was straightforward. I used the templates first of all to make sure the branches were in the correct location, then I put a bit of glue on the end of the branches and tacked them in place with a brad nail. While the glue dried, I also clamped it in place, although this was a little bit awkward at times, so I did the best I could. In this case, I made a little chock that I could put in between the branches so I could get a good clamping position. Most of the branches did match up nicely, but there were a few instances where they needed a little bit of material removed. So I just marked that up and then I took it over to the sander and back and forth until I got the right fit. And then just repeat until the whole thing was glued together. I want to finish this whole thing in a clear Hardwax oil, but I did some experiments with this and I found that the oil started to remove some of the green dye, and if I were to finish the whole thing in one go, that green dye would get onto the other surfaces. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to finish the green section first, and once that's cured, I can finish everything else. That means I need to apply masking tape so I can limit where the Hardwax oil goes. This is Oslec Clear Hardwax Oil, which you apply with a buffing pad and then you remove the excess with a cloth. This is also a UV curing Hardwax oil, which means it has the massive advantage of being able to instantly cure it and then start on the second coat. And that's it, 100% cured. And now I can apply the oil to the whole piece without any fear of the green smearing. There are a few corners that were tricky to get into, but I got there in the end. And now to mount this on the wall, and there's still a few little tricks to go. I wanted the piece to be offset from the wall because I thought that would look a lot nicer, so I 3D printed these brackets which should allow me to just drop it in from above. I also printed off this template, which in hindsight I should have made slightly thicker so it was a little bit more robust, and this marks the location for each one of those standoffs. I can get those locations on this piece and then I can transfer that onto the wall as well. Then in theory everything should just line up perfectly. It was all a little bit tricky here, but with some help from Dora we got there in the end. You just have to hope now that the holes in the wall match up with the holes on the piece. And then a nervous moment, will it fit? Surprisingly enough, with a bit of wiggling, it fit first time. And then just in time, those parts we ordered earlier have arrived. One of my favourite jobs as a design engineer was creating the design, sending it away, and then opening these boxes and seeing them realised for the first time in the real world. And here are a few extra pieces that we'll be using in an upcoming project. To mount the letters on the wall with the correct spacing, I 3D printed a template. I did say that 3D printer was going to get used a lot on this project. I then used some double-sided foam tape to secure the letters to the wall. I don't know about you, but I think this looks good, and I am so pleased with it. We aren't quite done with the office yet. I think that back wall is still looking a little bit plain, and there maybe needs to be a shelf on that wall, and it's going to have to be something special to match with the rest of the aesthetic. There's also a bit of an acoustic problem in this room, so we're going to have to deal with that. If any of that sounds good to you, then please do subscribe to the channel, give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and until next time, cheerio.